Listen, you expect Ohio to be a map of tidy highways, cornfields that roll like low green waves, sleepy towns with clock towers and diner booths where the coffee never gets cold. You expect the history here to be settler stories, factory smoke, Civil War letters and tidy archives. But step off the modern roads for a little while and the ground itself starts to speak a different language, an older grammar written in earth and curve and burial. What looks like a harmless rise in a field or a contour of a hill can be the trace of a civilization's hymn, a ceremonial diagram, or an effigy meant to hold the sky. We will take a long look together, and I promise you this, by the time we finish, the ordinary map of Ohio will have edges that feel a little frayed, and you'll find yourself wondering about the shape of time and how much of it can hide in a mound of soil. I'm not asking you to trade skepticism for superstition, far from it. We will interrogate evidence and date charcoal the way a careful researcher does. But we will also acknowledge the particular kind of human wonder that archaeology forces on you, the sense that someone, 2 millennia ago, stood here and chiseled a geometry into the ground that answers questions we have barely learned to ask. We begin with a question that will thread through everything you hear. Why build on such a vast scale, sometimes to no obvious domestic end? Why the labor that moved tons of earth into perfect circles, octagons, or the sinuous body of a snake? What social structure, what set of beliefs, justified that coordination? You'll hear precise measurements when we can verify them, lengths, diameters, radiocarbon years, as well as the patchwork of contradictions and debates archaeologists have fought over in long, polite ways at conferences and in journals. You'll hear also the mythic echoes that people living nearby still pass down, the whispered tales of lost tribes, of giants, of stones that hum when the wind is right. Let's keep both the footnotes and the nightlight imagination on the table. History is a discipline of fragments. The most honest thing we can do is to hold our evidence close and let it get a little luminous. Picture this: fog clinging to fields in early morning, the dew heavy on weeds, and a path that bends not because of a road but because the land itself was shaped by hands long gone. Picture, too, the sound of drums, low, rhythmic, perhaps imagined, perhaps not, echoing across a hollow where a circle was once the stage for unknown rites. We will stand at the edges of circles so wide they swallow the horizon. We will trace a serpent nearly a quarter of a mile long that curls and uncoils on a ridge. We will cross trade routes that stretch farther than the mind anticipates. Copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the Appalachians, objects that testify to networks, to exchange and ceremony. These are the sorts of scenes that complicate the simple view of prehistoric life as isolated and local. In Ohio, 2,000 years ago, people plugged themselves into a continent-spanning conversation. Still, for all the commerce and craft, they left behind questions that keep archaeologists awake at night, precise alignments that map the sky but resist simple explanation, monumental geometries that hint at mathematics or ritual calendars, unanticipated radiocarbon dates that tug on the edges of accepted chronologies. We will walk through these puzzles with curiosity and caution. Now, let us begin our first long walk into one of Ohio's most famous and most controversial places, a place whose image has become almost a logo for the mystery of North America's mound builders, a winding, monumental snake carved in earth that measures longer than a football field multiplied many times over. Imagine yourself there at dawn. The ground underfoot is soft from overnight rain, and a low wind pushes the fog in thin sheets. You can feel the slope of the ridge beneath the grass. You can see the sinuous curve of the effigy, its coils like a question mark frozen in soil. Many will tell you the serpent watches the sunrise. Others will say it marks the paths of stars. But whatever it meant, its presence is undeniable and uncanny. We still don't know. Start with the basics. An effigy, an earthwork shaped in the form of a serpent, a sculpture built by arranging earth into an elongated, raised form that resembles a snake with a curled tail. The body measures roughly 1,348 feet from head to tail, about 411 meters, making it one of the longest surviving effigy mounds in the world. That number feels precise, almost clinical, 1,348 feet. But the precision of a single measure sits beside an even wider uncertainty. Who built it, when, and why? For a century, the contest over its builders was academic in tone but heated in implication. One camp argued for the Adena people, builders of conical burial mounds, active roughly between 800 BC and 100 C, while another group's evidence pointed to the Fort ancient people who flourished much later, around 1000 to 1650 C. Still others pressed for a Hopewell connection, Hopewell being a broader tradition usually dated from around 100 BC to 500 C, celebrated for its geometric earthworks and far-reaching trade links. Each name carries with it not just a date but a world, different pottery styles, different burial practices, different scales of trade. Radiocarbon dating has both sharpened and blurred this picture. In some studies, organic sediments and charcoal samples have been dated to times as early as roughly 300 BC, suggesting that the mound, at least its earliest phases, might reach back 2,000 years. Other samples, taken in different contexts, come forward in the timeline to around 1070 C, aligning the mound more closely with the Fort ancient people. Here's where it gets tricky: soil can be deceiving. Mechanical processes, animal burrows, root action, historic disturbances, can move materials up and down in the layers and give dates that confuse original construction with later renovations. Archaeologists have had to walk carefully through those stratigraphic puzzles, balancing the physical dates with the typology of artifacts and the patterns of other nearby sites. What about measurements beyond length? The effigy's raised height varies, but in many places it rises roughly 3 feet above the surrounding ground, subtle when you're close but monumental when you view its full curve from a small hill. The mound sits on a plateau etched by ancient geology, and the topography itself seems to have been chosen with intention. Natural features, ridges, springs, and river bends, are often woven into the placement of earthworks, a fact that argues for a cultural geography where landscape and story are braided together. When people talk about theories, they often fall into a few broad families. The astronomical school theorists point to alignments, sunsets at solstices, the positions of bright supernovas, or the appearances of comets. One particularly seductive hypothesis ties the mound's dramatic curve and head to extraordinary sky events in the mid-11th century: the supernova of 1054 C that created the Crab Nebula, visible as a daytime star for weeks, and the passage of Halley's Comet a few years later. If the mound was constructed or remodeled around that time, it's plausible that a culture would commemorate such a celestial spectacle with a monumental effigy. Now, let's be fair, comets and supernovas flare across the sky and draw attention everywhere, so correlation does not equal causation. Still, the timing seems at least suggestive. Another class of theory focuses on ritual landscape and cosmology. In this view, the serpent is less a map of a specific event and more a symbol in a larger spiritual grammar, perhaps a guardian of water, an underworld figure, or a creature representing cycles of renewal. Serpents feed into many traditions across the Americas and beyond as beings that tie earth and water and sky together. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, the grass whispering, and imagine that your footfall traces a line once trodden by processions, people in ritual dress carrying offerings, or perhaps carrying their dead to a place of memory. The serpent, in this reading, is a stage and a ledger. It encodes myth and authority in its long, hypnotic curve. Then there are the trade and contact theories, which call attention to the wider pattern of human movement. Ohio was not an island. Artifacts recovered from Hopewell and related sites show copper from Lake Superior, mica from the Appalachians, and shells that originated near the Gulf of Mexico. These items chart routes of exchange that moved ideas as well as goods. It is therefore tempting to imagine that the serpent and other earthworks functioned as nodes in regional networks, ceremonial centers where leaders met, where marriage alliances were brokered, where long-distance pilgrims came to witness rites. But what kind of social machinery could organize the manpower to move such masses of earth? That invites speculation about leadership and social stratification. Were there chiefs with the power to call thousands, or was the work accomplished by seasonal religious communities whose reciprocity created the necessary labor? We still don't know. You will find sensational accounts along the margins of these sober debates. Local legends passed down over generations sometimes introduce imagery of giants, skeletons taller than men, skulls as large as a bathtub, grave goods placed with people of impossible stature. Scientific archaeology has not borne out any credible evidence of giants as evolutionary anomalies. The giant stories sit better in the category of myth and psychology, powerful metaphors for ancient people whose monuments dwarf the later settlers who encountered them. Still, myth matters. We cannot dismiss those stories as mere fancy. They tell us something about how successive peoples interpreted the traces they inherited. What does it feel like, for a settler or a farmer, to stumble on an earthwork with no local memory to explain it? The human mind invents stories to fill the silence, and sometimes those stories harden into local lore that persists for centuries. Picture yourself hearing, at dusk, an old farmer leaning on a fence and telling you of the night he saw a glow along the serpent's backbone. How would you record that memory? As an evidence point? As a cultural artifact? Both answers are necessary. Consider, too, the geology beneath the mound. The site sits atop what has been called an astrobleme, an ancient meteor impact structure, though the science on that point is nuanced. If the hill itself is a remnant of a cosmic collision, then the choice of location could be partly environmental and partly symbolic. Perhaps the prehistoric builders recognized the unusual topography and imbued it with significance. Natural idiosyncrasy often attracts human attention. Think of how we build shrines on cliffs and springs. Peculiar landforms invite story. Yet another trick in the archive is the evidence for renovation. In some places the mound contains layers that appear to be later refurbishments, patches added centuries after the original work, perhaps to repair damage, to reassert a ritual claim, or to update the monument's meaning as social beliefs shifted. Those later layers are a vector of conversation across generations. You can read a site as a palimpsest, where later hands write over earlier ones without fully erasing them. The archaeological record yields fascinating artifacts in adjacent contexts: burials with intricate grave goods, finely chipped flint points, copper ornaments hammered into shapes that speak to craft traditions, and beads from distant waters. Those finds are the tangible echoes of daily life and ceremonial practice. When Hopewell artisans manufactured objects that mimic animal forms, rays, birds, serpents, they may have been invoking the same mythic language the earthworks use. This interplay of portable art and monumental architecture suggests a cultural system where symbol making was practiced at many scales. Still, the specific grammar, what a serpent coil exactly meant to a person in 300 BC or 1100 CE, remains out of reach. We can hypothesize with elegance, but the final sentence sits in the silence. There are theories that verge on the speculative: ancient voyagers who carried astronomical knowledge, or even a lost priesthood whose calendar encoded complex interregional timekeeping. These ideas can be compelling, especially when the geometries of the earthworks display geometric sophistication, angles, precise curves, alignments that seem to encode solstices and lunar standstills. Yet the cautionary tone of science persists. Precise geometry can emerge from careful, repeated practice rather than from a single genius mathematician. We still don't know whether the makers used simple empirical measures, ropes, stakes, sight lines, to achieve their symmetry, or whether they had a written or ritualized formula passed between specialists. And the sensory element remains: stand at the foot of the effigy and listen. On a windless morning, the silence has weight. On a stormy evening, you can imagine the coils of the serpent as a stage prop for drama, thunder as percussion, lightning as a celestial signal. Picture yourself standing in the rain at twilight and feeling that the mound is less an object than a participant. It anchors sound, channels sight lines, commands your attention. That is the power of monumental earthworks. They were designed not only for durability but for drama. At the end of this first long look, we return to the essential dilemma. For every radiocarbon date and every carefully mapped contour, there are ambiguities. Some samples point to the Adena, others to Hopewell, others to Fort Ancient renovations. Some argue for cosmic triggers, supernovae, comets, while others insist on ritual continuity and landform significance. The more closely you examine the evidences, the more entwined the possibilities become, and that is precisely what makes the place both frustrating and irresistible. We still don't know who first set the serpent into the Ohio earth in the form we see now, and the question keeps opening to reveal more questions about movement, memory, and meaning. For now, as you walk that foggy ridge, you carry the rare privilege of being in conversation with decisions made by hands whose names we will never learn. That sense of connection to anonymous labor is a kind of human continuity that asks more of us than simply cataloging facts. It asks us to imagine the lives, the calendars, the griefs, and the celebrations that built this enduring line across the landscape. We will move on from the serpent to other earthworks and enclosures that reveal different challenges. Circular walls the size of a small town, octagonal enclosures whose geometry seems almost imported from another mind, cemeteries with artifacts that testify to a trade sphere spanning the continent. But hold this serpentine idea in your mind, a long, deliberate curve that both marks and asks. The mound is an argument in earth, a physical thesis about who matters, which moments are remembered, and how a people ties itself to the sky. And in the argument we still find only partial sentences. We still don't know. The Octagon and Great Circle at Newark, a perfectly measured theater of earth that refuses to behave like a simple burial ground, its geometry suggesting an astronomical purpose or a civic plan of a sophistication that would make you pause. Built by the peoples broadly grouped under the Hopewell tradition between roughly 100 BC and 500 CE, the Newark Earthworks are not a single mound but a sprawling complex, an octagon joined to a circle, an enormous great circle of nearly 1,200 feet across, squares and avenues radiating outward, a landscape so deliberately arranged it reads like a blueprint for the sky. The measurements are precise enough to make a modern surveyor sit up. The observatory circle's diameter is commonly given near 1,054 feet. The Great Circle's diameter approaches 1,190 to 1,200 feet, and the octagon contains 8 straight walls, each roughly 550 feet long. The walls once rose impressively, sometimes 10 to 13 feet above the surrounding plains, and in places the ditch inside the walls reaches about 5 feet deep. These are not casual piles of spoil. They are the work of people thinking in long lines, perfect arcs, and ratios that echo across different enclosures. To picture the sight is to feel small under an intentional sky. Imagine arriving at dusk and moving toward a low rise where the observatory mound once guided the view. When you stand there and look down the axis, you can see how the octagon and circle converse across the fields, as if a giant pair of compasses had been set down and the land itself had been traced with a steady hand. Archaeologists who have walked the lines note something else uncanny. Distances between centers and the proportional relationships among the figures are not random. In their work, Ray Hively and Roger Horn and others argued that the placements are calibrated to lunar motion, particularly to the Moon's 18.6-year nodal cycle, and that, from the observatory mound, the Moon's most northerly and southerly rising positions align with the octagon's axis to within a fraction of a degree. If they are right, the Hopewellists here were recording celestial cycles with intention and accuracy. Of course, measurement alone does not tell the full human story. The Hopewell tradition was a network of communities across the eastern woodlands that exchanged objects: copper from the upper Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, marine shells from the Gulf, and ideas. The Newark complex sits like a hub where such networks could gather and ritualize their alliances. Excavations in adjacent mounds and deposits have recovered finely made platform pipes, elaborately worked mica sheets with perforations, and ornaments of hammered copper. Those artifacts speak to ritualized craft and long-distance connection and suggest that Newark was as much a ceremonial crossroads as a local gathering place. But then the date and purpose puzzle returns. Was the complex primarily an observatory, a cosmogram encoding worldviews and calendars, a stage for political theater where leaders consolidated power, a mortuary center where ancestors were laid to rest with offerings, or all of the above at different times? The evidence supports multiple overlapping uses, and that mutability is itself part of the story. Consider what the labor behind such precise geometry implies about social organization. Who laid out straight walls 500 feet long with such consistency? How was labor coordinated across the floodplain to heap 7 million cubic feet of earth, an estimate given for some of the larger Newark works, if not by people with ritual authority and agreed-upon ceremonial calendars? We must be fair in our interpretations. Monumental architecture does not automatically imply an autocratic state in the way modern readers might imagine, nor does it prove a priestly caste bent on celestial cataloging. The Hopewell horizon appears to be a series of interconnected polities that could summon communal labor for seasonal projects, ritual centers that pulsed with people during certain times of the year, drawing in specialists, traders, and kin networks who worked together because social reciprocity required it. Still, for all the social hypotheses, the question of how the designers achieved the octagon's straight lines and the circle's near-perfect curve remains stirring. Did they use long ropes and siding posts, mathematical rules transmitted across generations, or some combination of empirical craft and inherited ritual protocol? Each method speaks to a different mental world. Theories about astronomical purpose are seductive because they sit at a junction of measurable fact and mythic imagination. When researchers show that the octagon, circle axis closely matches the moon's maximum northern rising point, the image that comes to many minds is immediate: priests or elders watching the moon's slow dance, marking times for gatherings, marriages, or wars, a calendar writ in earth for communities whose lives were tuned to the rhythms of planting, harvest, and the tides of social exchange. Yet there are alternative readings. The proportional harmonies of the Newark layout might encode ideals of social order rather than literal celestial calendars. The octagon might represent cosmological quadrants, halves, quarters, and octants of the world imagined as above, within, and below. Another view emphasizes performative space. The enclosures could be stages for rites in which sound, the movement of crowds, and the spectacle of processions mattered as much as sight lines to stones or stars. When a crowd of people presses into an enclosure, their bodies and voices transform the geometry into an event, and the architecture becomes a participant in social drama, not merely a measuring device. Picture yourself standing where the walls once cast long shadows and imagine the roar of 1,000 feet as a ceremony begins. The geometry then is both instrument and theater. Yet the Newark Earthworks keep their secrets, and in their quiet persistence they have become a battleground of meaning across centuries. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, parts of the complex were damaged or repurposed, segments leveled for canals, roads, and golf courses, so what the 19th century surveyors saw was already a palimpsest. That civic history is telling. Successive societies have read the ancient works through the lenses of their own needs, and sometimes those needs have been destructive. For present-day native communities, Newark is not only archaeological data but a living inheritance, a place that connects modern tribes with ancestral practices and cosmologies. That living connection has recently pushed for new stewardship and interpretive control, highlighting how the past is never truly past when it is woven into the identity of living peoples. So when scholars measure degrees of arc or compare lengths, they must also recognize the human stakes in how those measures are used, displayed, and interpreted. And then there is the layer of myth that colonists and later locals layered over the ruins, tales told of giants, of hidden chambers, of geoglyphs pointing to subterranean hordes. Those stories often served psychological and social purposes in the communities that inherited the landscape, explaining the inexplicable, asserting dominion over unlabeled pasts, or fashioning identity through the act of interpretation. Scientific excavations have not supported the notion of literal giants. Osteological analyses read skeletons into normal human variation, sometimes amplified by poor preservation or by single large bones found without context. Still, the giant legends are an anthropological datum in their own right. They tell us how people feel when they are faced with an architectural imagination that exceeds their own scale. They also reveal the hunger to imagine that the earthwork's significance extends beyond human calculation into the realm of myth. Picture an old map annotated by settlers, a circle here, a note of strange wall, an arrow to a spot where moon once rose. That palimpsest of cartography, lore, and scientific mapping is part of Newark's story as much as the mounds themselves. We should also confront the unresolved technical questions. How did the ancient builders maintain such proportional relationships over distances of 1,000 feet? Modern experiments show that with stakes, siding poles, and ropes, it is perfectly possible to create straight lines and arcs with astonishing accuracy. But then we must ask what ritual or technical knowledge held those teams together. Did certain line-laying specialists pass their craft in apprenticeship? Were there mnemonic chants to govern spacing, or standardized measuring cords whose length encoded cosmological numbers? The archaeometric evidence, soil analyses, stratigraphy, and the occasional datable charcoal can tell us the sequence of building phases, but they cannot easily recover the oral traditions or the apprenticeships that made the geometry repeatable. The silence on that point is a reminder that material culture and human memory are not the same thing. We still don't know. Close your eyes and imagine walking the wide rim of the Great Circle at dawn, the dew on the grass, a low mist sucking at the base of the walls, and in the distance the octagon's lines cutting the horizon like a ruler drawn across the land. Imagine, too, that someone centuries from now stumbles on your city's stadiums and wonders what the rituals were that made people gather there, what meanings were encoded into the plan of streets and stands that you now take for granted. In that inversion you can feel a kinship with the Hopewell planners. Both are making order from earth and stone, both are producing spaces that shape human life, and both risk leaving messages that future readers will struggle to decode. The Newark Earthworks are a testament to scale, precision, and the human appetite for ordering the world. They are also a lesson in humility. For every precise measurement we can state, a diameter, a circumference, a proportion, there remain questions about ritual, motive, method, and meaning. We still don't know who, in their mind, choreographed the moon to rise where it does, or the full catalogue of purposes those enclosures once served. Imagine then that you leave Newark behind and follow the river valley west, where the land folds into low ridges and oxbow bends and the air smells of wet earth and late-season leaf mold. Here, in the quiet near the meeting of creeks, is another concentration of mounds that reads like a library of human intent, conical graves like closed books, platform mounds that might have held houses of the dead or stages for ritual, and low embankments that mark the edges of former plazas. One of these clusters, often called the Mound City Group, once glowed in 19th-century descriptions as an almost uncanny forest of earthworks, dozens compacted into a few acres. Early settlers and antiquarians recorded them with a mixture of reverence and the habit of turning everything unknown into a collector's curiosity. In the 1920s and 1930s, archaeologists began to investigate methodically. They found primary burials with carefully arranged goods, long blades, polished copper crescents, mica ornaments cut with surgical precision, and charred remnants that, when radiocarbon testing became possible, sent dates back into the first centuries of our era. The Adena and Hopewell traditions overlap here in messy ways, and like all messy things they carry both evidence and contradiction in equal measure. But if Newark was a city-size phrase written on the land, Mound City reads more like a catalogue of intimate thoughts, family lineages, remembered chiefs, and the particular care humans take when burying those they love. Measure the Mound City Group and you see civilization in miniature scale, dozens of mounds within a compact area, some no taller than a bench, others rising a meter or two, collectively containing what modern excavation interprets as roughly a century or more of episodic use. The artifacts recovered, delicate platform pipes carved into animal forms, copper ear spools hammered from native copper, thin sheets of mica that once glittered like captured starlight, argue for a community that placed ritual and craft at the heart of social life. Yet here, too, the evidentiary threads pull in different directions. Some burials include individuals found with objects of clear foreign origin, marine shell gorgets and shark teeth from the Gulf, speaking of wide exchange networks that contradict any idea of isolation. Still, when you trace the sequence of construction and reuse, you also find evidence of changing tastes and perhaps religious reformations. Some mounds are sealed with a layer of earth that suggests a deliberate burial event, others reopened and reconfigured to accommodate new rites. The archaeology is, essentially, a social biography written in soil. We still don't know. If you continue south and cross into the plateau country, you come to Fort Ancient Country, so called after a European fort that later colonists mistakenly assumed had anything to do with the prehistoric earthworks. Fort Ancient, by contrast with Hopewell, belongs to a later chapter, roughly 1000 to 1650 C, a time when maize agriculture took firmer root, villages terraced hillsides, and social life reworked itself into new forms of allegiance and mobility. Ancient earthworks often appear more defensive in their configurations, palimpsests of embankments that cut across ridgelines and overlook river valleys, yet the idea of defensive is slippery here. Some enclosures might be fortified villages, others might be ceremonial compounds that only look like fortifications to wary modern eyes. The scale is generally smaller than Hopewell's grand geometries, but the human presence is dense. Pottery styles shift in patterns that suggest strong local identities, and skeletal remains hint at dietary changes as maize dominated the plate. Still, the motives behind the largest ancient enclosures nag at us. Were they erected in response to population pressures, to intergroup conflict, or to an intensification of ceremonial life that required new kinds of public spaces? We still don't know. And then there are the controversial artifacts that sit like peeled scabs on the history of interpretation, items that force us to ask not just who made the mounds but who wrote the story afterward. Among the best known of these are a set of inscribed stones and tablets that surfaced in the 19th century, objects like the so-called Newark holy stones, a small, carved slab depicting a human figure and a larger inscribed stone bearing what some claimed were Hebrew characters. When such finds were announced, they ignited fierce debate. If genuine, they would suggest transoceanic contact or lost Near Eastern influences. If forgeries, they would expose the 19th century hunger to rewrite the past in familiar, biblical scripts. Modern scholarship, while cautious and concerned with context, tends to view these items skeptically. Questions of provenance, the curious circumstances of discovery, and anachronistic motifs weaken the argument for ancient Old World contact. Yet the stones live on in legend and in the imaginations of those who prefer grand contact narratives to the slower, more tangled stories of indigenous innovation. Here is a lesson about interpretation. Artifacts do not speak in plain language. They whisper through context, and sometimes that whisper is drowned out by the shout of wishful thinking. We still don't know the full story of how 19th century politics, religious fervor, and antiquarian prestige shaped the way Americans saw their prehistoric past, and that sociological question folds back into our understanding of the mounds themselves. Travel further to the south and east, and you find the earthworks that plain-spoken farmers first called great circles, and square walls, sites that some 19th century observers mistook for Roman camps or European fortifications. Those ideas, wild as they sound now, tell us more about the minds of the interpreters than about the builders. The reality is by far more interesting. These are evidence of indigenous ingenuity. At works in the Ohio Valley, archaeologists documented burial practices where bodies were interred with arrays of grave goods that intimate rank and belief. In some burials, multiple individuals were arranged together with animal bone and crafted goods, suggesting compound kin groups and possibly the ritual reallocation of status through mortuary displays. In other graves, the presence of exotic materials, copper, mica, marine shells, suggests that gift exchange was a language of power. To be buried with such objects was to be integrated into a web that spanned hundreds of miles. The social texture here is not flat, it is a weave of kinship, ritual obligation, and trade. We still don't know. Now breathe in the mythic tone that always hovers above these archaeological facts. Local storytellers, both indigenous and colonial descended, passed down images that placed the mounds in the world of giants, of lost tribes, of ancient voyagers who held secret knowledge. There are accounts, framed more often as anecdote than as evidence, of farmers unearthing enormous skeletons, of pipes that sang when struck, of stones that bore inscriptions in languages no living ear could decipher. These reports contain kernels of cultural richness. They reveal how later peoples made sense of monumental structures they inherited without living traditions that explained them. For native communities, the past was often not merely a record but a continuity. The mounds carried the spirits of ancestors and encoded ceremonial obligations that periodically surfaced in festivals and retellings. For Euro-American settlers, the mounds were a mystery that begged to be folded into a biblical timeline or reimagined as evidence of Old World presence. The clash between these interpretive frames shaped early American archaeology, and it shapes how we, even now, approach the earthworks with both humility and curiosity. We still don't know. And yet the material record insists on the everyday as much as it insists on the extraordinary. Slip a hand into a midden, a trash heap, and you feel the ordinariness of clay, bone, and food scraps accumulated over decades. Those refuse piles, often dismissed by amateurs as unromantic, offer the most honest glimpses into diet, domestic craft, and daily rhythms. Chemical analysis of bones tells us about corn and deer and the seasonality of harvests, where patterns on tools hint at tasks like hide scraping or woodworking. Pollen trapped in sediment reconstructs the surrounding flora and the ways people manipulated their environment for food and fiber. This is the sobering side of archaeological wonder, that the great narratives of astronomy and ritual sit atop a substratum of pragmatic living, cooking, child-rearing, weaving social ties. If ritual explained the map, subsistence made it possible. We still don't know. Picture yourself at dusk in a valley where these various strands intersect: farmers' fields, a low bank marking the outline of a once grand circle, a lone interpretive sign weathering toward illegibility, and the distant silhouette of a church steeple. In that scene you can understand why the past resists a single tidy explanation. People made these places for reasons both practical and transcendent. They traveled, traded, argued, loved, and buried their dead. They also argued with the sky. Each mound is an argument between earth and meaning, a place where work, devotion, and social necessity met. Walk slowly here and you begin to feel the human scale under the grand geometries. Hands smoothing clay, breath fogging in winter, voices chanting beneath the ribs of a mound. The archaeological record can tell us volumes about technique and trade routes, but it cannot recover the cadence of those chants, or the private grief that might have accompanied a burial. In that absence the imagination fills in, and sometimes the imagination errs. We still don't know. Turn now to a quieter, less public kind of mystery, the artifacts that appear to be intentionally broken or ritually killed before burial. Across multiple Ohio mound contexts, archaeologists have found objects snapped, bent, or perforated before being interred, an act that seems deliberate, perhaps marking a transfer from the realm of the living into the sacred precinct. This pattern suggests beliefs about objects' lives and deaths. To ceremonially break a tool may have been to retire it into the care of ancestors, to release it from mundane use and invest it in ritual potency. Alternatively, the practice could have been a practical measure, to disable weapons or paraphernalia so they could not be used again, or a social message, an object consumed by group ritual to show unity. Each hypothesis is plausible. Each opens on to deeper questions of belief and custom. In other words, the material is generous with clues but stingy with certainties. We still don't know. So as night gathers over the river and the mounds stand like silent sentinels, we return to our method, measure carefully, record generously, and listen to the stories people bring to these places. For every confident chart of dimensions or convincing radiocarbon date, there will be a rival interpretation, a mythic counter-narrative, a 19th century forgery, and a living memory that complicates the clean lines of print. The earthworks hold many truths, and each truth sits like a shard in a larger mosaic. As you walk back to your car, the path lined with the soft hiss of insects and the heavy scent of the river, remember this: mystery is not simply a gap in knowledge to be filled. It is often the condition for wonder that makes us look twice at the ground, at history, and at ourselves. We still don't know. The next place I want you to imagine is not a single monument but a scattering of quiet hills around Chillicothe, a region where the earth keeps folding itself into graves and plazas like pages in a heavy book that someone repeatedly leafed through with careful, reverent hands. Chillicothe's landscape is threaded with Adena and Hopewell signatures, conical mounds capped with stonework, low-walled enclosures that might once have bounded a plaza, and the occasional large burial pit whose fill reads like the notes of a long-dead census. Who was honored? Which objects mattered? Which families persisted? Walk the ridges at late afternoon, and the light flattens the slopes so that mounds become soft domes against the horizon of oaks. Stand on one, and you feel the hush of a place that has been curated by generations of hands. Excavators working here in the late 19th and mid-20th centuries recorded burials that sometimes contained the single most striking artifacts of the region: worked copper collars, mica cut to catch and fragment the sun, long blades of obsidian or flint whose cores indicate a mastery of fracture and form. Those finds suggest not only craft skill but also a social vocabulary, ornaments that communicate rank or role, objects that act like badges in a social economy where face-to-face recognition mattered. But even this intimate archive resists tidy translation. Which of these objects were once daily tools and which were sacred tokens? Which burials represent chiefs and which mark sacrificial rites or kin bundles? We still don't know. There is a kind of structural intimacy at these Chillicothe sites that forces a different set of questions than those posed by Newark's grand geometries or the serpent's sweeping coil. Here, the question is not solely cosmic alignment or continental trade, it is about social biography and the life course of persons and families. In multiple mound contexts, archaeologists have noted sequences of interment that suggest repeated use over decades. Children laid beside elders, goods inserted and later removed, layers of earth tamped in ritual rhythms. Bioarchaeological studies of bones recovered here and in related Ohio contexts revealed traces of diet and disease, enamel hypoplasia that hints at childhood stress, isotopic signatures that tell of maize's growing dominance in the food web, arthritic markers that suggest the labor of a life spent bending and carrying. Those traces translate into human stories that are at once ordinary and ancient, mothers grinding corn at dawn, hunters negotiating turf, elders who remembered a famine. Yet the same sites also hold grand gestures, burials with elaborate grave goods whose mere presence complicates egalitarian readings. How do we map honor and hierarchy onto peoples who likely moved between communal obligation and intimate reciprocity? The debate shapes everything from the way we imagine political power to how we interpret ritual labor. We still don't know. From Chillicothe it is not far to trace the river's arc and arrive at places where stone and water combine to make a new kind of puzzle. There are springs throughout Ohio, small, private fountains where clear water collects and sometimes forms peat edges that preserve artifacts with uncanny fidelity. In bogs and damp depressions, archaeologists occasionally find objects whose preservation is remarkable: textile fragments, wooden paddles, even organic offerings that in drier contexts would have dissolved into the earth. These wet places sometimes appear to be deposit sites, intended garbage, ritual offerings, or votive caches, places where things were intentionally left to the water. A handful of such deposits include compounds of seeds and carved bone or arrangements of stone that suggest deliberate placement. Were these acts of propitiation to water spirits? Offerings to ensure the ruin of an enemy's crops? Or domestic discards that later acquired ritual significance? Interpretation teeters again between the practical and the spiritual. If you stand at one of these black water springs at sunset and drop a pebble in, watch the ripples. They echo into the same unsettled questions the archaeologist must keep returning to: intention, pattern, meaning. We still don't know. Now imagine a low, wooded ridge where the floor is punctuated with a mortuary hill that local storytellers call by a name older than the maps on your phone. They tell of a night when thunder rolled and lights glimmered over the top of the mound, a sight that some hold as proof of lingering spirit presences. Anthropologists often treat such accounts with polite caution, but to listen to them is to hear a living tradition wrestling with the past. For some native communities, the mounds are not relics to be measured, they are relatives, places where ancestors' spirits persist and where obligations continue in ceremonial seasons. That living voice reframes archaeological inquiry. Artifacts are not just data, they are part of conversation. When scientific teams excavate or sample a mound without regard for that conversation, they remove a layer of meaning beyond the stratigraphy. This tension is not metaphysical hairsplitting, it has concrete consequences for how sites are managed, interpreted, and kept. Recently, repatriation efforts and collaborative stewardship have shifted the balance toward more respectful practice, but the history of extraction and display still casts a long shadow. We still don't know how the full reconciliation between scientific study and indigenous stewardship will evolve. But we know this: the mounds are not ours to own outright, and the stories that cling to them are as important as the carbon dates we cite. There is another class of site that tilts our curiosity toward technology and translocal movement: the quarry and workshop sites. Ohio's prehistoric people did not sit still. They moved raw materials and skill across landscapes. At certain locations, outcrops of flint, glacial erratics chocked with high-quality stone, archaeologists find concentrations of debitage, the flakes and cores left by knappers at labor. These are the industrial zones of the ancient world, places of repetitive precision where a trained wrist could flute a blade to razor sharpness. The presence of finished blades far from their source points to exchange systems that could move objects hundreds of miles. The ways in which tools are reworked and retooled along their life cycles give us clues about maintenance and reuse. A spear point snapped on impact becomes a ceremonial object. A knife's edge is ground down and reworked. A broken ornament is ritually killed and deposited in a mound. These patterns feel intimate and technical at once. Human beings solving material problems while embedding their solutions in social symbolism. Yet the social pathways by which a blade journeys from quarry to burial are complex. Were these items traded as gifts in alliance-making networks, pocketed as loot after raids, or carried by pilgrims moving along ceremonial routes? Each pathway conjures a different human drama, barter, violence, or devotion. We still don't know. Let us turn now to a place of whispers and contested objects, the edges of fields where 19th-century collectors made dramatic claims. Those are the contexts that introduced oddities like inscribed stones and alleged foreign artifacts into the story of Ohio archaeology. When colonists dug into a mound and pulled out a stone with crude letters or strangely shaped icons, the interpretive impulse often leapt toward the familiar, toward biblical narratives or toward tales of lost Old World travelers. That cultural hunger tells us as much about the 19th century imagination as it does about prehistoric transoceanic contact. Modern archaeology trained its methods precisely to avoid such leaps. Controlled excavation, stratigraphic recording, and cautious typology are buffers against wishful thinking. Still, the desire to connect Ohio's mounds to global scripts persists in certain circles. And to approach the past without acknowledging that desire is to miss a layer of history about how people make meaning. So when you hear the story of a carved stone discovered in a rural field, remember two things. First, how such discoveries may be contaminated by later actors. Second, how those same mise-en scene reveal the social needs of the people who found them, needs for identity, lineage, and narrative authority. We still don't know whether any single outlying artifact changes our story of pre-Columbian contact, but we do know the cultural power these finds exert in the public imagination. Around the edges of towns and beneath the roar of highways, there are also technological surprises, drainage modifications, borrow pits used to supply earth for construction, and modern intrusions that complicate stratigraphy. A 19th century road cut, a 20th century cellar, or a 21st century septic system can move artifacts and organic matter between layers, creating the very confusions that later radiocarbon dating must untangle. The modern world does not merely stand above the ancient, it actively edits it. That editing makes archaeology a kind of detective work where the prime suspect is time itself, and the clues are smeared by subsequent hands. It is a humbling reminder, our neat chronologies, Adena, Hopewell, Fort Ancient, are tools for thought, not crystal case certainties. The more we dig and date, the more we see overlap, renovation, and reuse, the more we must hold our narratives in provisional form. We still don't know the full sequence of many sites because the places we want to read clearly are often palimpsests of human activity across centuries. There is a final Ohio theme I want to ask you to picture before this section closes: the human urge to pilgrimage. If Newark and Chillicothe sketch the architecture of ceremonial life, then consider the people who walked between these nodes. Stories embedded in objects suggest networks that could stretch from the Gulf to the Great Lakes. We can imagine canoes loaded with copper and shell, groups traveling on foot with ritual paraphernalia, traders and kin crossing the land to attend seasonal gatherings. The idea of pilgrimage reframes earthworks not as static monuments but as stages and trajectories of movement where people recalibrated identities and negotiated alliances. When you imagine yourself on such a pilgrimage, picture the small details: the weight of a shell gorget against your chest, the sun on your back as you crest a ridge, the sound of a small child crying in a traveling camp. These are the human particulars that animate the grand arcs of architecture and trade. The records we have, artifact dispersal, isotopic evidence, and oral echoes, make pilgrimage plausible and persuasive, but the exact routes, the ceremonies of arrival, and the meanings assigned at each hearth remain partially veiled. We still don't know. As the sun slips under the trees in this part of Ohio, notice how each site refracts the same questions in different light, how scale and form encode social worlds, how objects traverse distances and acquire new meanings, how myth and scientific method entangle when people seek to claim ancient sites for modern identities. The mounds, the circles, the quarries, and the springs all converge into a single lesson: history is layered, messy, and profoundly human. We can measure diameters and record radiocarbon years, but those measurements do not exhaust the lives that underwrote them. Imagine, for a moment, the ritual voice of a person who stood where you stand now and thought of the land as inhabited by sentient shapes. Then imagine the rational voice of an archaeologist who recalibrates that sense using stratigraphy and statistics. Both voices are necessary to enrich our understanding, and both leave open a final, stubborn question. After all the careful work, all the surveys and dates, after all the attempts at reconstruction, how much will always remain a mystery that invites us into imagination rather than into certainty? We still don't know. Stand with me now on the edge of everything we have walked: the serpent's slow coil, the octagon and great circle carved with such measured intent that they still argue with the horizon, the clustered intimacy of Mound City, the graveled workshops where blades were spun from stone, the water-hung offerings cradled by peat and silence. Let us gather these scattered testimonies not as a final inventory but as a braided argument about what it means to be human in a long landscape. At first glance, the mounds and enclosures are objects, measurable, datable, describable, and we have been right to study them with the tools of science: stratigraphy, radiocarbon laboratories, geometric surveys that map alignments with a precision that would have flattered the hands that set the stakes and stretched the ropes. Those tools give us a scaffolding of fact, and without that scaffold our imagination would be untethered. Yet even as dates and dimensions accumulate, so do silences, gaps where the archive does not record the sound of a child's laughter, where the cadence of a ritual chant evaporates in the weight of centuries. Those silences are not failures of the discipline. They are the very reason we feel the pull to keep asking. They are the small, aching places where wonder takes root. We have seen the human drive that binds labor to meaning, the way enormous investments of time and muscle were marshaled to lift Earth into shapes that outlast generations. That work implies commitments, seasonal rhythms of agriculture that freed time for communal construction, social protocols that could call hundreds to dig and tamp and shape, a shared cosmology that made deeds of shaping into language. Whether a circle marked the path of the moon, whether a snake effigy recorded a celestial event, whether a mound kept the bones of chiefs or kin, the impulse is the same: people sought to make the invisible intelligible by inscribing it into the visible world. They tied sky to soil, lineage to landscape, ceremony to choreographed labor. The scale of those inscriptions astonishes not because prehistoric peoples were more powerful than we are but because they chose to fix their meanings into forms that endure beyond lifetimes. That endurance is a message; they expect it to be read. But reading is a fragile act. The past we reconstruct is always a conversation across strata, the physical layers the archaeologist opens, the artifacts catalogued and compared, the oral memories passed down or reinvented, and the fantasies projected by later hands that tried to fill gaps with the shapes of their own myth. 19th-century curiosities and spurious artifacts remind us that the modern appetite for narrative can distort the evidence, yet those same distortions are also part of the field's history and tell us about how communities have wanted to see themselves on the stage of time. Counterpose those fantasies with the patient, repetitive craft visible in flint napping scars, in copper beaten thin enough to catch dawn, in the geometry of an octagon aligned with lunar nodes, and you will feel the tension between human imagination and human method. One is not more legitimate than the other, they are different voices. Our job as listeners, as readers of landscape, is to hold both voices in a critical embrace. There is also an ethics to listening. These are not neutral stones but places entangled with living communities whose genealogies may flow into the same rivers that once carried ritual offerings. Recent decades have taught us how wrong it is to treat human remains and sacred space as mere data points divorced from the descendants and traditions that still lay claim. Collaborative stewardship, repatriation, and the recognition of tribal sovereignty in interpreting and caring for sites are not merely politically correct changes. They are corrections that restore a fuller humanity to the record. When an excavation is planned now, the conversation should include the people for whom those mounds are relatives and obligations, not curiosities to be possessed. That shift does not weaken science, it deepens it, because it introduces cultural perspectives that illuminate questions archival methods alone cannot decode: why an object was placed in a particular grave, why a ceremony was held in a low mist on a ridge, what it means to have ancestors present in landscape. The connection between scientific method and ethical stewardship is not incidental. It is essential to a robust, honest telling of the past. And yet, even as we refine our methods and broaden our circle of respect, a stubborn humility remains necessary. For every alignment we verify, for every artifact we trace across trade routes, new questions emerge. Did a particular monument mark a temporary cosmological innovation that lasted a generation? Or did it encode a belief that structured society for centuries? Did the people who hauled Earth into a perfect circle speak of their work in terms we can read? Or did their metaphors and categories diverge so radically from our modern schematics that we will only ever see reflections of their intentions? Archaeology gives us a partial grammar. Imagination converts grammar into stories that help us live with the trace. The best of those stories are provisional and reversible. They are hypotheses held lightly, not dogma nailed to a map. There is also a human cost to forgetting how provisional our interpretations are. When a monument is simplified into a bumper sticker explanation, Romans built the mounds, or aliens drew the snake, we do violence to actual human lives that produce the traces. The truth is more beautiful and more complicated. These landscapes are the cumulative labor of peoples who negotiated ecology, who invented craft technologies, who maintained relationships over distances and over generations, and who sought through ritual and architecture to make sense of their world. To call the mounds the product of lost tribes, people invented yesterday, is to erase the complexity of long-standing indigenous cultures who were both ordinary and extraordinary in ways our preconceptions often fail to grasp. So what, finally, do these monuments mean for us now? They mean that time is thicker than the calendar on your phone, that human projects can outlast the languages used to name them, and that continuity is not only a genealogical chain but a conversation across material forms. They also ask us to practice a kind of historical empathy. Imagine the small, daily acts that underwrote monuments, the meals that fed diggers, the songs that kept rhythm, the arguments over measurements, the children playing at the margins while elders aligned stakes with a practiced eye. Picture the sorrow that might have gathered at a burial, the hands smoothing soil, the small personal objects deposited with intentional tenderness. Those human particulars are as important as the grand geometries because they are the breath that made monumentality possible. There remains the question of wonder. Wonder is not opposite to science, it is its necessary companion. When you stand at dawn by a great circle and feel the geometry of the land press on perception, wonder sharpens the scientific question. Wonder makes you care enough to count, to date, to preserve. But wonder can also be misused as license for a sloppy story. The difference is simple. Wonder followed by method refines awe into knowledge. Wonder without method settles into fable. We need both. Let our amazement drive rigorous inquiry, and let our inquiry be humble enough to leave room for beauty. And so we return to where we began, with the open landscapes and the sounds of evening insects. The mounds, the effigies, the wetlands with their votive pebbles, the quarries running with the echo of a knapper's hammer, these are markers of a human project that was as much about community as about cosmology. They speak of people who negotiated the world both practically and poetically, who encoded memory into landforms and sent artifacts along rivers to make visible the invisible ties that bound them together. They teach us how to listen, to measure, yes, but also to read the textures of memory and myth, to accept evidence while keeping our imaginations honest and provisional. There will always be mysteries. Some will dissolve as methods improve, others will thicken into new questions, spurred by better dating techniques, by DNA analyses that reveal migrations and kin ties, or by collaborative projects that bring community knowledge into conversation with scientific data. Each new tool is not an eraser of wonder but a pencil that sketches new possibilities that will, in time, be revised again. This is the excellent humility of historical inquiry. It is always an ongoing conversation where each generation refines the terms of the question, never assuming the conversation finally closed. What matters most, beyond the technicalities and debates, is the relation these sites create between you and the past, a relation of curiosity, respect, and agile imagination. The mounds of Ohio ask us to slow down, to let the horizon stretch, and to recognize that human life is always bigger than our immediate projects. They invite us to reframe time so that the work done by hands we will never know can still speak into our present. They remind us that history is not a museum case to observe from a distance, but a lived landscape offering the chance to respond. By protecting, by listening, by telling stories that make room for both the facts and the feelings. They ask, finally, for a little care in how we handle the traces of human life. So stand, if you can, one last time on a ridge at dawn, the light like a thin gold against the grass, and imagine the sweep of centuries under your soles. Feel the modest weight of a whole human labor beneath you, the songs, the tools, the hands that pushed Earth into a circle. Know that every measure, every date, every artifact is a hand extended across time, asking to be met not with certainty but with thoughtful curiosity. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.